Throughout the middle of the last century, Dorothy Hartley travelled the length and breadth of the country to write about the life and works of the people of England. So we are here at the Museum of English Rural Life to uncover some of the stories of the people. This episode, The Blacksmith. According to Pirkei Avot, the text written by the Jewish forefathers, God created the first pair of tongs, which makes sense if you think about it, because for any metal worker to make a pair of tongs, they would need a pair of tongs. But how did that pair of tongs come down to the world of humankind? Well, that is said by some to be the oldest folktale in the world, and it goes a little bit like this. At the fall of humankind, men were told that they would have to work hard to get their food from the land. And work hard they did, digging at the land with their bare hands in order to plant their seeds and reap their crops. And it would be a hard life right up until the moment they died. But about that time too, the devil still had to resort to trickery to earn the souls of humankind. And so, around about the start of this story, the devil went to see a man called Smith, who at this point was still a rather young man. The devil beckoned Smith over to him and said to him, "Your life is so full of toil and struggle, but I could make it an easy life for you by sharing with you some of the knowledge from God's own workshop. All I ask for in return is your soul." Well, what man could refuse such an offer? The chance to have an easier life, maybe spend more time with his family? Smith thought that his soul wasn't such a big price to pay for such a great reward. So he pledged his soul to the devil in return for the devil's help. And the devil went to God's workshop and brought back fire. And he explained to Smith, "Why do you sow and reap from the land using your bare hands when you could have tools to help you do it? Before you can reap your food, you need to reap these tools. And you can get them from the very rocks you find around you. Place them in this heat, and those rocks will bring forth the tools that you need." The devil spent a little bit more time with Smith, showing him exactly which rocks to gather, to melt down in the flames, blend the liquids together until they hardened into solid tools that could be used to work the land. And then the devil left Smith to it for a good few months before returning to check up on him. When the devil returned, though, he found Smith looking rather sorrowful. And Smith explained, "This is not making my life easier. I'm not able to go and sow and reap the food for my family because I'm having to spend all my time by the fire, waiting for the rocks to melt and the tools to come forth. If only there was some way to make this faster, then I would still have time to work the land. My family are going hungry without me." The devil listened to Smith's complaint and then said, "Would you like your life to be even easier? I can make it so by sharing with you one of the tools from God's own workshop. All you need to do is remember the price you promised me." Well, of course, Smith repeated the pledge of his soul. And so the devil went to God's own workshop and brought back an object that looked like two thick, heavy planks of wood with handles at the end. Between them was a bag that tapered down to a point at which there was a hole. These were God's bellows. And the devil showed Smith that if he aimed the hole down at the base of the fire and squeezed the handles together, then air would gush forth, helping to turn those thick orange flames and the dark smoke that bellowed forth into an even brighter, even hotter fiery furnace. One that was able to melt the rocks and get the metal out far faster. And after the devil had instructed Smith in the ways of the bellows, he left him for a few months and returned a little while later to see how he was getting on. But he found Smith still with a very gloomy look. "Yeah, it is true that I am able to get metal far quicker from all of these rocks. But when it hardens in the wrong shape. It's like just long, flat planks of metal. I can dig with them for a bit, but they snap far too easily. I keep having to come back and repair them or make new ones. And so I've got less time to sow, less time to reap. I'm not able to get as much food, and my family are going hungry without me." Well, the devil listened to Smith's complaints and then said, "Would you like your life to be even easier? I could make it so with another tool from God's workshop. All you need to do is remember the price you promised me." Well, Smith repeated the pledge of his soul. And so the devil went to God's workshop and brought back an object that looked like a long wooden handle with a hard piece of metal on top, one end of which was round and flat, the other end of which was tapered to a point. This was God's hammer. And the devil showed Smith how to use it to bash the cooling metal into shape. And then, when it cooled completely, it would be exactly the right shape that was required for Smith to go and dig holes in the ground to sow his seed, or fashion blades that could be used to reap the crop at the end. After instructing Smith in the ways of the hammer, the devil left him for a few months and then returned to see how he was getting on. But he found Smith looking just as gloomy as ever. "Okay, so I'm able to fashion the right sort of shapes from the metal now. But it takes so much out of me as I'm down on my knees hammering away at all of that metal. It drains my energy. I barely have the strength to go out and sow and reap, and my family are going hungry without me." The devil listened to Smith's complaints and then said, "Would you like your life to be even easier? I could make it so by sharing with you one more tool from God's own workshop. All you need to do is remember the price you promised me." Well, Smith repeated the pledge of his soul. And the devil went to God's workshop and brought back what looked to Smith like a table, but it was a table the likes of which he had never seen before. It seemed to be fashioned out of a solid block of metal, the top of which was completely flat, one end tapering to a point, the other round and curved. And the devil showed Smith that if he put the cooling metal on top and began to use the hammer to bash it into shape, this special table caused the hammer to bounce back into the air, making it a far easier job. This was God's anvil. And after the devil had instructed Smith in the use of the anvil, he left him for a few months and then returned to see how he was getting on. But he found Smith looking just as glum as ever. "Oh, the anvil has certainly made it easier to save energy using the hammer, but now I'm having to run around and chase after all of the tools that fly off the anvil whenever I strike them. And because I'm spending so long to just bring all of the tools back and hammer them into shape, I've got less time to go out and sow, less time to reap, and my family are going hungry without me." Well, the devil listened to Smith's complaints and then said, Would you like your life to be even easier? I could make it so with one more tool from God's workshop. But this tool is an item of such power, it will require a far greater price. I will not just need your soul, but the soul of your children and their children, so all your progeny rest with me. Well, now the devil was asking for a far greater price than he had ever done before. So Smith asked if it would be possible for him to see this tool before he made his pledge. And so the devil duly went to God's workshop and returned with God's own pair of tongs. This tool had 2 long forks of metal that could be pinched tight to hold anything fast. Now, cooling metal was still so hot that it would burn the flesh of Smith if he tried to hold it down. But using this tool, the devil showed Smith how he would be able to keep the metal from moving so that he could employ the hammer. But the devil warned Smith that this particular pair of tongs, being God's own tongs, would hold anything fast, even for as long as eternity. Smith would be able to use these tongs to make other pairs of tongs, which he could share with his children so that they too could work the metal of the earth and create their own tools. But this particular pair had the power to hold fast a raging boar. And so the devil told Smith he would need to take very good care of this particular tool. Well, immediately upon hearing the full extent of the power of this object, Smith readily pledged not only his own soul, but the soul of his entire progeny going forward. And he promised the devil too that he would not let God's tongs out of his sight. After the devil was sure that Smith was fully instructed in the ways of the tongs, he left. And this time, he took a few more years before returning to see how Smith was getting on. By now, Smith had grown into a much older man. He had many children who were starting to fashion their own tools out from the metal, using tongs that Smith had made for them. And they were using those tools not just to sow and reap, but also to fashion crafts that they could use to journey to new and distant lands. And also weapons that they could use to protect those lands jealously from each other. The way humankind was evolving across the whole world suited the devil perfectly. Watching the way they jealously guarded their own lands from each other and developed hatred towards each other meant that their souls would soon be ripe for his taking. But now the time had come for him to harvest the soul that he had been promised right from the very beginning, the soul of Smith. The devil went and found Smith in his workshop, standing over God's own anvil, using God's own hammer to smash a piece of metal that he was holding with God's own tongs. The devil entered and let Smith know that it was time to go with him. Smith had been waiting for this moment. He was prepared for it. He placed down his hammer, and with a swift move that he had been practicing for many months now, he caught the devil's nose in God's own tongs. Of course, the devil realized being held fast in God's own tongs meant there was no chance of escape. And suddenly he found himself having to beg for his life from the very man whose life he had come to claim. Please let me go. I will do anything. Just please get it off. It burns. It wasn't just heat from the metal that Smith had been working which tormented the devil so. To be honest, that had already started to cool off. Rather, it was the fact that these were God's own tongs, and so they were fashioned with goodness. That was what burnt the devil right down to his very bone. And after letting the devil struggle for a little bit at the end of the tongs, Smith replied, "Don't worry, good friend, of course I will let you go. I wouldn't want to hold you here for eternity. You have been so good to me and my kind, making our lives so much easier. All I ask in return for your freedom is that you return to me ownership of my soul, and you relinquish your claim of the souls of all my progeny." Of course, the devil realized he didn't really have a choice, and so in return for his freedom, he relinquished his claim over Smith's soul and the souls of all Smith's children. That didn't actually stop the devil pursuing each of Smith's children for their souls individually. And in fact, some people say that the devil is still pursuing souls today, but he never again went near Smith. And that's why Smith is somewhere in the world still alive today. Of course, his soul had been tainted by the pact he made with the devil. The devil wouldn't take him, but neither would heaven. And that's why the profession that Smith practiced and shared with many of his children has been tarnished with a black brush ever since.